morning and welcome to this week's Reset for Life video. Got a question for you. Who would you die for? I want you to think about that for a moment. Which people in your life, if any, would make the cut? Which people would you willingly give up your life for? Would you die for your parents? Would you die for your best friend? What about your children or your spouse? Contrary to what Hollywood portrays, Secret Service agents are not required to take an oath swearing to take a bullet for the president. Members of the military don't sign up to hoping to get killed in the line of duty. It's just not in our DNA to want to die for somebody else. Sure, we might do it out of instinct or out of a spur-of-the-moment decision, but it's not something that we choose to do with a lot of thought. I want you to hold on to that idea for just a moment. Last week, we finished up a series with these videos titled When God, and we highlighted the times when God did something or was a certain way. Today, I want to start a new series titled But God. I've often told my congregation that my two favorite words in the Bible are but God, and there's a reason for that, really. Years ago, my friend Hilda, who happens to be a copy editor for a national magazine, she told me that the word but is a transition word. It's used to connect ideas that are actually opposite to each other. When used, the word but signals a change in the conversation. It signals a change in the direction that the writer or the speaker is taking. In fact, when you use the word but, it's supposed to encourage the reader to forget or disregard everything that comes before it and to only remember everything that comes after it, to focus on those things that come after it. I want you to remember that the next time someone comes to you and says, "Listen, I'm sorry, but..." You know, the Bible is full of but God statements. They remind us that though life may feel and actually be one way, God is able to create change and transform what we are feeling or experiencing. He's not limited by our limitations. He's not scared of our fears. He's not blocked in by our dead ends or our doubts. But God reminds us that God always has the last word in our lives. And no matter what people say, no matter what the circumstances are around us, no matter what we feel, or even what seems rational and logical, there is always a but God response to what we are facing. Now, it might come in the form of a new truth that we need to implement into our lives. It might come in the form of His healing touch upon our lives. It might come in the form of a restoration of a relationship or even the financial provision that you so desperately need. Life circumstances don't dictate God's ability to be able to respond to us. He can take any situation and change that outcome for His glory. So the first but God statement that I want to deal with this morning comes from Romans chapter 5, verses 7 to 11. Verse 7 actually says this: "Now most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good." And then verse 8 says this: "But God," now here we go, "but God showed His great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners." You know, in spite of the fact that most people wouldn't give up their lives for a good person, God decided to send His Son, Jesus Christ, to give up His life for sinners, people who were diametrically opposed to who He is as a holy God. In fact, verse 10 says that we were actually enemies of God in our sin. A Secret Service agent or a person in the military might die because of their enemies, but they would never die for their enemies. I don't know about you, but I have never, not even once, considered giving up my life for my enemy. Not that I have many or even any, but if I did, I wouldn't consider dying for them something even remotely interesting to me. And that's why I'm not God. These verses really remind us that in spite of what we wouldn't do for one another, God actually does for us. His love, verse 7 says, resulted in His Son's death on our behalf. And verse 10 also tells us that our friendship with God was restored by the death of His Son. Now, two things I really want to point out here. Number one, if our friendship with God was restored, then that means we once had friendship with God and that it was taken away. Here's a truth you really need to understand. Sin always takes more than it gives. In fact, it really doesn't ever give. It just makes us think that it gives. And in this case, it took us away from actual friendship with God. Secondly, if Christ died for us while we were still His enemies, think of what He's willing to do in our lives now that we are friends. You see, the key to this whole portion is understanding that it was God's love for us that actually compelled him to send his Son to die for us. The result of that unconditional love from God showed us that it is stronger than even our love for one another. God does not play favorites. He doesn't pick and choose, who he decides to die for. He died for everyone who was his enemy so that they would choose to accept that and become actually friends of his again. I don't know about you, but for me, that message is incredibly humbling. To know that the God of the universe loved me so much that he chose to die for me, that he chose to make a way for friendship between us to be restored back to its original design. That's the kind of God that we serve, friends. No matter what you're facing, but God. That's my Reset for Life word for today. God bless.